Thank you, Diego.
La última mesa de diálogo que
We're running out of time. Sorry about that, but we're going to have our last dialogue. So please be patient with us. We just want to keep you here interested in a new topic for a little bit longer. So now we need to understand how SMEs, freelancers and citizens will also see all of these different aspects. So we're going to have a dialogue about people, how citizens are facing these challenges. So we have Dr. Loreto Barrios, who's a researcher, an architect and a psychologist. She's been working on sustainable technologies, and Stuart Capstick, I hope he's with us, although albeit virtually. Yes, he's here with us.
Stuart is Deputy Director del Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation. Colabora con el team del Center for Climate Change Research e investiga habitualmente en lo que es el comportamiento.
He is working with the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research and an author of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. So first of all, what would be the first thing that we should consider? What would be the consumption trends, the behavioral trends once this is over? Our consumers will want to go towards the zero emissions scenario, or they would want to go back to what they knew before. Loreto first. Well, based on history and even Toynbee, Seneca, and different historians and researchers have talked about how civilizations crawl and collapse, or they survive and grow. Already in the 17th century in Europe, and with rationalism, we've seen that research is not always completely objective. It's something that can be immaterial. It can be full of paradigms. We can talk about Newton physics, we can talk about Einstein and relativity, and then we can talk about quantum physics. So each one of these paradigms is not saying that what came before was wrong. It says, well, no, I can expand on this concept. I can expand on everything that we've learned from. So for many years now, we've seen that the emotional side of things is something that we need. We can research on that. We have functional MRIs that are helping us to see when our brain areas get illuminated depending on the emotions. We are understanding that when we find a community where they are more generous, they tend to live longer. In Japan, people live quite longer. As far as I know, at least, in Okinawa, they realized that all of them had this ikigai, this feeling of, I have a mission in life, something that makes you feel motivated to go beyond the basic, the frivolities of the day by day. And we've seen that many of these communities that have really long lives, they're also interested in protecting the environment and the society. If we analyze the political perspective, we can also talk about Germany after the wars. That was a situation that can be within certain limits but compared to the situation we're living today. We're in a society that is surrounded by uncertainties. We are in a society that needs a strong leader. Maybe that's not the best leader you can get, but it's a leader that will give you some certainties. And then history will tell you if you were right or wrong selecting that leader, but it will depend on our leaders. Our leaders will make the decisions that will decide our path. According to the development objectives of the United Nations, most of them are talking about human values. And I wanted to show you an image. I was showing it to Iñigo before. I don't know if I can show it to you. I'll try to. Let's see if technology helps. Do I have to turn this on? Can you help us, please? So this was the graph more than an image. Sorry about that. This is the trust barometers of 2020. When we talk about our leaders, our societal leaders, today people trust scientists, not the administration, not the politicians. We keep on seeing our politicians fighting each other to death almost on television, but scientists and the people that are next to us in our local communities. And this is very interesting to see. It's not our institutions. We trust in those where we have an emotional relationship with them, a certain sense. And a lot of people today have been talking about resiliency. And I wanted to show you this photo of what resiliency is for me. This is another Japanese concept, kitsukuroi. When a dish or a vase gets broken, they don't throw the pieces away. They rebuild it using golden lacquer to put them all together. So you have the fact that they're practical and they are aesthetically pleasing to see. So you are building on your own destruction, you're rebuilding, and you're showing your scars. So I think the society feels this need of values. No, we have like a pyramid of requirements, and in Europe we have all our basic needs covered, most of us at least. So our generation, and especially younger generations, are demanding more values. And the only thing I would like to mention is the fact that we need to mourn. We need to mourn what has happened. There's this need to go through what has happened, to make sense of all this sadness, this loss. A lot of people have lost loved ones, and this is something that has been terribly sad and difficult when you are grieving someone that has died and you have not been able to say goodbye. So I'm going to leave the floor to Stuart now. Can you give us your point of view? Have you listened to the translation?
No, I don't have translation, unfortunately.
Okay, so what sort of ideas can you share with us about when we are a little bit over this crisis? What do you think that will be the behavior and the consuming uses of all the citizens? Will we advance towards the decarbonization, or we will go back to our old habits?
I think that's a very good question, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that. I'd like to sort of share a few thoughts on that question with you. So I think so far we know, or it looks like emissions globally will drop by around 6 to 7% during the course of 2020 as a result of the pandemic. Of course, nothing deliberately intended to reduce emissions, but a large part of that has been due to behaviour change, particularly in relation to transport, how people move around. So people have changed their behaviour. And behind that sort of headline figure of 6 to 7% estimate, actually at their peak, emissions were 17% lower in April of this year compared to last year. And emissions from surface transport, from cars and other vehicles, were down by a third in April, and aviation was down by nearly 2/3. So a starting point to answer that question is that we know that rapid and sudden behaviour change can have big impacts for climate mitigation, for emissions reduction. But yes, the concern is certainly there that despite these changes, when lockdown conditions are lifted, many of us may well go back to our old ways. And I think for me as a psychologist, that's because much of our everyday behaviour is grounded in habit, routine, convention, and these things are supported by stable contexts. What do I mean by stable contexts? Well, some of this is down to the physical environment, including transport infrastructure. So roads and cities that are made for cars lead people to drive in them and to them. And I think cultural and social expectations are also important. So for many people, the working day has always begun, ended in the driver's seat of a private car, alongside thousands of other people doing the same. So we need to understand that what has led to the behaviour change that's behind emissions drops has been a temporary suspension of those conditions. And if those conditions return to how they were before, then many of our behaviours will too, I think. But there are some ways that change could happen, that we might see a persistence of those effects. First of all, any disruption to our habits and routines can lead people to reflect more consciously on their choices and actions. So quite a number of psychology studies show that when people's routines are disrupted, for example, when they move house, then they're more likely to consciously think about how they take travel decisions than if they're established pattern of behaviour. And some research that my centre did during the lockdown has shown that the disruption we've experienced during this year has led to many people to reflect on their choices they make. So we did a public perception survey of 1,000 people in the UK. We found that before lockdown, around 1 in 10 people worked from home, but this rose to over 1 in 3 during lockdown. And more importantly, most people found this to be a positive experience of those who did do this. And as a result, many plan to do more of it in the future, suggesting we may see some lasting effects. And likewise, almost half of our survey respondents said they would reduce how much they fly once lockdown eases. So we can expect to see some persistence, I think. But of course, a lot of people can't work from home, but it does suggest that habits and routines are in a state of flux. But what's more important, I think, than individuals reflecting on their choices of it will require interventions and policy changes to lock in those lifestyle changes over the coming years. And this is something that government and industry can influence. So in Wales, in the UK, where I'm based, Wales has regional powers, and the government has officially stated they want to see 1/3 of people working from home, not just now and in response to the pandemic, but for the foreseeable future. So the government there is proposing local hubs for remote working to help people, and to help people work near a home, as well as spending money away from city centres. And likewise, in terms of aviation, it seems likely this may never return to pre-COVID levels. So while there will be some rebound, I think individuals and businesses have got used to not jumping on a plane when alternatives will do, such as WebEx and Zoom. And there's an opportunity for businesses to lock in changes by changing their expectations and practices. So in summary, I think if we simply go back to the pre-COVID world, how things were then, we can expect to see some small changes in people's practices persist, but we will see many behaviours rebound. But if we do see ambitious structural changes implemented by governments and business, this does have the chance to lead to more longer-lasting behaviour change.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Ahora una pregunta para Loreto, ya punto de vista arquitectónico.
Now I have a question for Loreto. How do you think this COVID can impact the design of buildings and the management of spaces, even in urban areas? Crises in architecture have always led to different designs. After the Second World War, there was this movement in Berlin, ventilation improved, so crises always lead to better ideas. In San Sebastián de los Reyes, here in Madrid, we found a project by the town council which encouraged owners of houses to take energy efficiency measures in return of being able to construct or build more square meters. Square meters are always a limitation, and owners sometimes are limited by this amount of meters that they can build. And I think that this idea is quite creative in this regard. Other changes, well, we'll need to review different models, such as the passive house is quite hermetic, and ventilation to take place. Office spaces maybe are not so demanded, and the truth is that we are in the way of, or in the path of creating changes. Stuart.
The cultural, contextual and personal factors underpinning sustainable lifestyles. Where can you work in that direction? What can we do?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways it's easier to say how these things give rise to unsustainable lifestyles, but I'll try to answer this question in a way that points to more positive factors. And I talked a bit about travel and transport just now, and I think it's important to contrast different countries' approaches to this and different cities' approaches. And in some places, the culture is to travel actively in a low-carbon way. So the Netherlands is often mentioned in this regard, and I think rightly so. a few times I've been to the Netherlands, including Groningen, where there's a lot of environmental psychology research. As a British person, it's actually quite sort of shocking and amazing to see how people can get around. And the important thing here is that this is normal. This is the culture to cycle in the everyday context for how people get around. In terms of personal factors, a lot of things matter for whether or not people are concerned about climate change and support climate policy. But one of the most important things is our values. So knowledge matters, and how we understand the climate crisis matters, but really it's about our underlying values. And so a lot of research shows that if people are focused in a general sense on the world beyond themselves and beyond their immediate interests, if they see themselves as part of something bigger, so this is technically called self-transcendent values, then they're more likely to be concerned about and act on climate change than if they're focused on things like status, power, wealth, and their own interests. But the most important personal factor determining whether people have high or low footprints is becoming increasingly obvious. I think it is wealth and income. And so whilst the psychology does matter here, a person's income is a very important factor, perhaps the most important factor in determining carbon footprint. So if you have a high income, you're more likely to live in a large house, consume many resources, and to drive and fly often.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Pasando ya a un área que ya has tocado en tu primera intervención más psicológica, ¿qué recomendación harías a las empresas y a los profesionales para gestionar los equipos en estas condiciones de incertidumbres, grandes cambios y que parece que el teletrabajo puede quedarse en parte? ¿Cómo gestionar la energía de grupo para que siga empujando proyectos, ilusionando y haciendo que las empresas vayan cumpliendo sus objetivos?
Esta pregunta me encanta. Parece...
I really love this question. It's Ortega y Gasset in 1936 warned against the barbarians, the ignorance, and maybe sometimes we looked for specialists, but the truth is that we need multidisciplinary groups, especially in times of crisis where disruptive thought is very important, where creative is important. We need to have the knowledge of everyone. We need to have philosophy, we need to have anthropology, etc. So my recommendation would be to have different teams with different people, diversity. A very famous philosopher in Spain said that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and that's something that we need to remember from the Second World War. It is very important to remember our past. Technicians sometimes do not take this human part into account, and we need to have it. We need to support them, because we are not all philosophers and we don't understand everything. We don't know every single piece of information that we need. So we need support from other groups of people. We also need to work on the role of women, and that's not because I'm a woman. It's not a personal perspective. Rwanda has the most inclusive parliament in the world, and they include women, and they have included women by tons, because a lot of men died in the war and women had to take more responsibility. So it was like a forced situation, and women have different characteristics. We don't need to deny that women are carriers, and we have different characteristics, but we've seen that countries who managed the crisis of COVID better were led by women, and that's another reflection that we need to take into account, and that really it's important. The truth is that not all narcissists are men, but we need to balance a little bit the situation, and I'm sorry for saying that, but we need to be more balanced and to have more emotional aspects into account and find an interesting way out. And I think that the role of women is very important. And then teams are very important. It is very good to think about a win-win solutions or nothing, because the games where one wins and the other loses are self-destructive, but there are win-win solutions that we need to imagine, that we need to to bear in mind, and we need to be mentally prepared to reach or to have win-win solutions. Companies, workers, freedom for people to have all synergy inside, to have the necessary creativity that we need to break the binary 1-0. No, synergy is much more than that. So multidisciplinary groups to work good. Stuart, how can you combine?
Was this climate change? What suggestions could you make just to be able to advance forward quicker and engaging all the population?
Okay, I mean, I think in some of the discussion I've heard already, I think what's clear is that we have sort of multiple intersecting crises, probably an economic recessional crisis coming up in many countries, a current health crisis, etc. And I think that the main thing to remember, and we all know this, and I've heard other people say this, is that these are not separate problems. Climate change is an economic issue. Climate impacts as they unfold will have major consequences for economies around the world. So when we talk to people, to the public about climate change, we sometimes do it in a way that pits the environment as if this is a thing you can draw a circle around, the environment against the economy, and you can have one or the other. And we saw this the other day with the presidential debate, and when Joe Biden talked about transitioning away from oil, a lot of the media coverage was about the harms to an industry and jobs. Now, of course, that is very important to take into account, but really we have to think of these problems together. And I think that often we've not done a particularly good job, I say we as whether that's psychologists or communicators or people trying to engage with the public, in terms of how we communicate about climate change as if it is a separate thing. And it is a health issue. I mean, I work on a project, the journal The Lancet has a project looking at climate impacts, and the things that are going to affect us through climate change will in many ways affect our health and our well-being, and also the things that we can do as individuals and as communities to address climate change can also be beneficial for health. So we need to think in that more holistic way. So if we can find ways to get out of our cars and travel more actively, that's better for our health. If we can change our diets to be more healthy, there's some excellent research showing that for the most part, diets which are in line with WHO guidelines tend to be lower carbon diets. So I think we should try and think of these issues as being synergistic. And although we're in a very difficult and terrible time at the moment, there is an enormous opportunity as well to make sure we do these things in a way that we have a sustainable future, and that the economic recovery measures can be understood by people in a way that this helps with jobs and supporting communities, but also helps to ensure we don't have bigger emergencies facing us down the line.
Thank you very much, Stuart. There is a few questions from the audience.
Thank you, Stuart. I don't know whether we have much time, but
how can we promote better communication of climate change? ¿Cómo podemos favorecer la comunicación sobre el cambio climático?
Qué pregunta. Creo que el académico va a contestar mejor que yo.
I think
Acaba de hablar el de la comunicación.
Sure, very happy to do that. I think one thing that we have done a lot in the past, and we as climate communicators of all sorts, is to communicate the science. And there's been good and bad ways of communicating the science. But one way or another, we've sort of bashed our way through the jungle, and now most people around the world, and particularly in Europe, but also around the world, there's research showing that most people do accept the reality and the importance and the need to act on climate change. So the basic science has got through. Now, of course, there are still going to be skeptics and people who don't agree, but we've achieved that message. What we need to do, I think, to focus our communication now on the social and the political challenges. That climate change is something that is very much part and parcel of our lives and how we run our countries and how we lead our lives, and I think that has been missing, and sometimes there is a sense as well in which the solutions to climate change are often framed in quite technical or technological manners as if that's somehow separate from our lives, but I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that unless we have citizen engagement, unless we all sort of participate in this, and not just in a kind of making platitudes way, but this is a bit like COVID, you know, this is serious and we all have to be on board and to find our way through this. And I think that sort of social and political emphasis is where we need to be putting our focus for communication in the future.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Time is over, ya nos hemos excedido el tiempo.
We ran out of time, sorry about that. We didn't manage our second objective, which was to be punctual and on time, but we wanted to create an interesting conversation. I think we managed that. So in order to conclude, we have a short video, really, really short, I assure you. So you're still online, don't leave us, because it's just some statements from the different companies that are part of the Spanish Committee of the World Energy Council. Thank you, and...
Lo pone aquí.
La respuesta a la crisis económica es la de acelerar el cumplimiento de los objetivos a 2030 de la transición energética. Solo así conseguiremos una economía más moderna, resiliente y competitiva.
La crisis originada por la COVID-19 ha tenido un impacto drástico en nuestra sociedad y en nuestra economía. Las compañías energéticas hemos tenido un papel clave a la hora de garantizar la continuidad de la actividad y nuestro papel seguirá siendo muy relevante en la recuperación económica. Para ello debemos integrar en nuestras estrategias y nuestros modelos de negocio una agenda ESG que nos permita dar respuestas a las demandas de la sociedad.
El futuro energético y climático tiene una especial relevancia. La respuesta al COVID debe contribuir a intensificar y acelerar la lucha contra el cambio climático. La transición energética, que pasa por la electrificación de la economía, debe ser palanca en la recuperación económica. Además, justa, con atención a las zonas más afectadas y a los colectivos más vulnerables.
La seguridad de nuestros trabajadores, junto con la garantía de suministro, han sido nuestras mayores prioridades en esta situación de COVID, y para ello hemos contado con el compromiso de nuestros trabajadores.
Los planes de estímulo por la crisis del COVID suponen una oportunidad histórica de financiación y ayudas para nuestra economía, pero tenemos la obligación moral de no dejar una deuda sin más, sino de legar una economía mejor, más competitiva, más sostenible y más resiliente. Pero tenemos que empezar desde ya.
La crisis de la pandemia pone todavía más de manifiesto retos tan importantes como la lucha contra el cambio climático, la lucha contra las desigualdades y, por supuesto, la mejora en la gobernanza de todos los temas que afectan a la sostenibilidad. En este sentido, Naturgy aprobó en su Junta de Accionistas del pasado mes de mayo la creación de una comisión de sostenibilidad delegada del Consejo que supervisa, vigila y propone los objetivos que nos van a guiar durante los próximos años.
Necesitamos una industria potente que garantice un suministro seguro, asequible y sostenible para todos, y que además nos garantice evitar la dependencia de terceros países. Ahora más que nunca es fundamental que todos los actores del sector energético trabajemos unidos, que unamos nuestros esfuerzos y que de la mano de todas las soluciones tecnológicas encontremos los proyectos y las inversiones más coste eficientes para trabajar en la descarbonización y en una recuperación económica lo más rápida posible.
La recuperación económica será verde y digital, y desde el sector gasista impulsaremos la digitalización y los gases renovables, pieza fundamental para el mix energético del futuro.
La crisis del COVID nos recuerda el papel indispensable de la electricidad en nuestras vidas. La energía es esencial para la recuperación económica y la gran oportunidad está en avanzar activamente en la transformación de los sistemas energéticos, apoyar la innovación y garantizar la sostenibilidad.
Durante esta terrible pandemia que ha cambiado nuestra forma de vivir, el sector energético ha respondido de una forma sólida, cumpliendo su función de ser el servicio esencial que ha permitido que los demás servicios esenciales funcionen. Y desde Viesgo queremos permanecer fieles a nuestro propósito, siendo la energía para el mundo que queremos.
Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Thank you very much for being here virtually, and I will recommend you to visit our website. You'll see our very interesting studies on the different scenarios and trilemma. Thank you very much for being here today. Hope you enjoy the day.